when thinking about the next milestones in MS research, I think we have two big questions. The one is around progressive MS, and the other one is around dissecting more specific treatments for individual patients. So again, filling the gaps in our knowledge about the disease and pushing this research area forward.
I think one of the biggest breakthroughs that I've seen is that we're now trying to hit the disease from many angles, not just targeting the cellular component, but also the psychological component, the physical symptoms that patients tend to deal with on a day-to-day basis. We're now treating them as well.
The next breakthroughs I think that we need to focus our attention on for MS treatment is really to focus on the progressive type of the disease, the progressive form, and in particular trying to understand how we can protect the nervous system from the damage, protect neurons in the brain and spinal cord from being damaged by the disease, and to promote recovery of the myelin that's lost in the disease.
Early diagnosis and preventing the disease from happening in the first place. I really think that that's a great way to put an end to MS ultimately. But for those who've got MS, it's all about remyelination. It's all about repairing the damage that has already occurred.
There are a number of breakthroughs that I think we need to make in terms of MS research. I think that one of the key things with MS research is that the biology of MS is still a bit of a black box, and so we still need to grapple better with the biology underlying MS and MS progression. I think particularly understanding progressive MS and what drives it is one of the key breakthroughs that we need to make, and I'm working on that.
Welcome to MS Research Australia's second live update. I'm Renee Coffey. I'm a Kiss Goodbye to MS ambassador, and I'm also a person living with MS. Tonight I will be your host as we live stream right around Australia and in fact anywhere around the world. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Yuggera people, and acknowledge their elders past and present. And I would also like to thank our event partners for tonight's broadcast. Firstly, our content partners, the fabulous Go Collaborate, and our streaming partners in the live stream, Go Live Australia. Having access to live streaming has meant we are able to connect to people and their families living with MS wherever they are and on any device. Tonight, we are being live streamed from the 2018 International Society of Neuro Immunology's Congress, which is being held right here in Brisbane. This is an amazing event and a huge privilege for Australia to be hosting. The event has brought together a large number of the world's preeminent neuroimmunologists to Australia, many of whom this is their first visit to Australia. From that amazing group, we have hand-selected 4 leading researchers that I will interview to update and inform us on what they are doing and, more importantly, what they're learning about in this space. Tonight, we will hear from Professor Michael Pender, who is going to be talking about his research into the Epstein-Barr virus and its relationship to multiple sclerosis. Living with MS, we're always hearing about inflammation, but what does that really mean? And how does that impact our disease? We have Professor Amit Bar-Or. He will give us a rundown not only on inflammation, but also specifically on neuroinflammation as well. Then we're going to have a short break. And after the break, we have Dr. Jack Antel, who is going to be talking about the biology of progressive MS. And whilst we're on the subject, Professor Ann Laflamme will join us to talk some more about progressive MS. And the tip is, she will be sharing an interesting story with us about targeting the immune system. Finally, I'll hand over the reins to our very own Dr. Hamish Campbell, the Research Development Coordinator at MS Research Australia. He will conduct a Q&A of your questions to our panellist of scientists. We have a list of questions that have already been submitted for the Q&A. However, if you haven't had a chance to submit your question, or if a question comes up while we're talking to the scientists, please do email those through, and the email address is up on the screen now. It's inquiries@msra.org.au. So let's get started. First, please welcome MS Research Australia's Head of Research, Dr. Lisa Melton, to give us an update on the great stuff that they have been doing at MS Research Australia.
Thanks, Renee. So thanks you all for coming. It's really very exciting to be part of the Neuro Immunology conference and bring you this live update from the conference. Neuro Immunology is the study of the nervous system and the immune system and how they interact in both health and in disease. So of course this is a really important topic for the MS research community. Now this is, as Renee said, this is the first time the international conference has been held in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's brought together researchers from over 35 countries. So it's really exciting to bring all those people together and see all those people working together here in Brisbane. MS is not the only brain condition involving the immune system. So there are researchers here who are looking at Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, psychiatric conditions, motor neuron disease. And they're all learning from each other. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about these types of conferences. We're only 2 days into what is a 5-day conference, but already we've heard about how the immune cells move in and out of the brain, how they interact with the immune cells that are already resident in the brain, and also how we can perhaps harness the good side of some of these cells, and yes, they do have a good side, to enhance myelin repair and protect the brain. And just this morning, for one example, there was an excellent session on the gut microbiota and its potential role in MS. It's complex, there's so much still to learn, but it's becoming really clear that there is a role for the gut microbiota in MS, and we've got more work to do there to really understand it. For MS Research Australia, international collaboration, the international collaboration that's evident at this conference is really key to us being able to do the work that we need to do, and to support young researchers in particular on the world stage at a conference like this is also fantastic. Promoting international collaboration is a core part of the work that we do at MS Research Australia, and the linchpin of this is our involvement in the Progressive MS Alliance, the international alliance that's bringing together MS organisations, people with MS, industry, researchers, clinicians, to all focus on progressive MS and finding solutions for progressive MS. And we're going to hear more about that about progressive MS from some of our speakers tonight. But being involved in the alliance is really exciting, and seeing the momentum that is building from that collaboration is very exciting. Collaborating nationally is also really important to us, and in particular MS Research Australia is part of a collaboration of like-minded charities and researchers that are all looking at different types of immune conditions. And so we're learning from each other, we're working together on common themes of research, treatment, and prevention in particular is a really important part of that collaboration. But still, at the very core of what MS Research Australia does is supporting Australian MS researchers to do what they do best. And just recently we announced 5 exciting new incubator grants, small pilot grants to get new ideas off the ground. And these are looking at areas such as the genetics of MS, gut microbiota and diet in MS, sleep, which is a big problem for some people with MS, and also predicting disease outcomes and treatment outcomes early on in the course of the disease to optimise treatment for people with MS as soon as possible. One of the things we very recently did was launch an economic impact of MS report. And this might sound a little bit dull. We know that MS is so much more than about the dollars and cents. But this report is really interesting on a number of levels. Unfortunately, it shows that the cost of MS is still rising, that more people with MS are living with MS in Australia. But one of the most exciting things that jumped out of this report when I first looked at the results was that 8 years ago, when we compared this data to the report we did back in 2010, 8 years ago, of the total cost of MS in Australia, 50% of that cost was due to lost employment for people with MS and their family members. Now in 2017, 2018, only 32% of the overall cost of MS is due to lost employment. And I think that's a really positive sign that things are turning around for people with MS. They're able to live well, to stay functioning, to stay employed, and to continue looking after their families in the way they want to and maintain that quality of life. So I think that's a really positive, hopeful sign that has come out of this economic impact report. So I'll hand you back over to Renee to hear about that research.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And also a heartfelt thanks to all the work from MS Research Australia, the vital support you give to our amazing Australian scientists. So thank you, absolutely, thank you.
Renee.
And for all of you live streaming this event from home, don't forget that you're an important part of this conversation as well. So make sure you join in. We do have a hashtag. It is RealMSResearch. Now it's time to meet our first panellist, Professor Michael Pender. Professor Pender is an Australian neurologist who has been pioneering a novel MS treatment targeting the Epstein-Barr virus. Please make Professor Pender welcome. Welcome, Professor Pender.
Thank you, Renee.
So what is the Epstein-Barr virus?
Okay, it's a truly amazing virus. It was only discovered 54 years ago, but it's been co-evolving with primates, including humans, for the last 40 million years. And it's unique among the human viruses in that it is the only virus that infects a type of white blood cell called the B cell, which when matures makes the antibodies that protect us against different infections. And it not only infects that cell, but persists indefinitely in it for years, for the lifetime of the infected person. And it actually induces a clonal increase in the number of those cells. So, and in healthy people, 90% of the adult population are infected with EBV. And once a person is infected, they carry it the rest of their lives. And every day, healthy people, including most of us in this room, are producing up to 10 billion infectious particles in our saliva. We don't even know about it. The immune system is working very hard behind the scenes to keep EBV under control. And the main way it does that is by another type of white cell called the killer CD8 T cell, which kills EBV infected cells and in healthy people keeps them under control.
Thank you. And so what is the connection between the Epstein-Barr virus and MS, or what do you think the connection is?
Well, over the last 40 years, there's been increasing evidence of a link between EBV and MS. Firstly, in 1980, it was shown that people with MS have higher levels of antibodies against EBV. And then soon after that, it was shown that virtually everyone is infected with MS, is infected with EBV, that you really can't get MS unless you're infected with EBV. And since then, further studies have supported a role for EBV in MS.
So how do you think that the Epstein-Barr virus might contribute to or cause the autoimmune conditions, including MS?
Well, I was intrigued in the early 2000s by the fact that EBV is uniquely associated with MS. It's the only infectious agent that virtually infects everybody with MS. And the same is true with another human chronic autoimmune disease, lupus, systemic lupus erythematosus. And I was aware of that and it intrigued me. And I thought, well, there's something unique about EBV and MS and lupus, and therefore I think all chronic autoimmune diseases. And what is unique about the biology of EBV? Well, it is the only virus that infects human B cells and clonally expands them. So it just hit me one day coming back from a conference that this might be what's going on. So I published a novel theory in 2003 proposing that all human chronic autoimmune diseases, including MS, are based on uncontrolled EBV infection infecting B cells, autoreactive B cells capable of making antibodies against the brain in MS, against the joints in rheumatoid, against the islets of the pancreas in type 1 diabetes and so on. And that this arises because of a defect, perhaps genetically determined defect, in the killer CD8 T cell control of EBV, which normally keeps EBV under control.
Fascinating. So you've been working on a trial of adoptive T cell immunotherapy treatment for MS based off this research and the theories. Can you tell us what is the treatment and why you think it might be helpful, particularly in progressive MS?
Yes, well, just to fill in one point, So one of the predictions of my theory in 2003 was that there would be EBV-infected B cells in the brain in MS. That was shown in 2007, but then some other studies couldn't find it. But then this year, 2 independent studies have confirmed that EBV truly is present in increased numbers of cells in the brain in people with MS and in the joints in people with rheumatoid arthritis. A separate study has shown that. And so one of the key predictions of my theory was that if this is true, that controlling EBV infection, either by, say, rituximab or ocrelizumab, which kill all EBV-infected, all B cells, including EBV-infected B cells, or a much more specific approach, T-cell therapy, could be beneficial in MS. And we treated the first person in the world with MS with this approach 5 years ago, and have, as you say, we've now completed a phase 1 trial of this therapy.
Fantastic. We've got some photos. At what stage is this experimental treatment at? So you've had the first phase, the first clinical trial. How did that go?
Yes, well, we initially treated one patient with progressive MS, a patient of mine 5 years ago, and that was encouraging. And the trial we've just completed is a phase 1 trial of 10 people with progressive MS, 5 with primary and 5 with secondary progressive, with very encouraging results, and we're in the process of preparing that for publication.
So in your mind, what are the remaining questions regarding this treatment, and what needs to happen next to make it become a reality as a treatment for MS?
Well, further studies are needed to determine whether, so far it appears to be safe, but more studies are needed for that. Control studies need to be done to see if it's effective. The question of what is the optimal dose of cells, we used a fairly low dose of cells. Would a higher dose be still safe and more effective? How often should the treatment be? Should it be re-administered, and if so, how often? And there's a new study launched by Atara Biotherapeutics, which we're involved in. It will involve 15 centres worldwide, and in this case, the T cells, instead of coming from the person with MS, are coming from healthy people who've been infected with EBV. And that trial has commenced, and we are involved in that trial. So it'll be very interesting to see if it is safe, if it is effective, well, what is the best approach? And the other important question is whether, if it works in progressive MS, will it also be effective, and I believe it will be, in relapsing remitting, and that's another MS, and that's another important question.
Fantastic, thank you, and it's great to see Australian scientists leading the charge in this, so I acknowledge that and thank you very much for your work. Could everyone please join with me in thanking Professor Pender?
Thank you, Renee. Thank you.
So, remember, if there is someone who you think would enjoy this update and be interested in the live stream, please do make sure you share the link on Facebook and also the link to our website. And remember, if you do have a question for our panel later on, there is still time for you to email those through. And again, the email address is on screen. It's inquiries@msra.org.au. Next up, we are very fortunate to have Professor Amit Bar-Or, who is a neuroimmunologist from the University of Pennsylvania. But before we meet Professor Bar-Or, earlier this year, we asked our researchers what they would say to someone who has just been diagnosed with MS. And here's what they said.
I always say to patients, when I first meet them with a new diagnosis, I tell them things are going to get better from here. This is the bottom of the well at the moment because you've just had the diagnosis and you haven't started any treatment. And we're so lucky that we live in a time where we've got so many treatment options.
There are good people doing good things in this field, and breakthroughs are coming thick and fast. That if we can halt the progression of your disease, if it's detected early, if you're diagnosed early, you can take steps very early on to halt the progression, giving you the time that scientists need to develop ways of helping the brain repair itself, to stop the damage before it continues to go on?
I can tell them a lot of positive things. I can tell them that there's hope. I can tell them that there are hundreds of researchers within Australia and internationally that are looking to help them.
Their future outcomes are looking quite positive. We've made massive advances in medical research in the last 10 to 15 years, and we continue to make progress. And so I think that somebody diagnosed today compared to somebody even diagnosed 10 years ago is likely to have really great outcomes.
I'd say that they're in a much better position today than they would have been 10 years ago. There's a lot of new therapies available today that were not available a number of years ago, and MS researchers are working tirelessly to find newer and better treatments to treat the disease.
What I would like to say to all the patients out there, you're not alone. It might sometimes feel that you get confronted with a situation you don't know how to deal with it, but there's not only the clinicians and the nurses supporting you. There's also like this wide nets of researchers, and we know about your problems, and we are there to help solving them. So please don't give up your hope.
Some wonderful messages of hope there from our researchers. Now, please welcome Professor Amit Bar-Or. Professor Bar-Or is the Director of the Centre of Neuroinflammation and Experimental Neurotherapeutics, and we're going to be asking him about neuroinflammation in MS. Welcome, Professor Bar-Or.
Great to be here, Renee. Thank you.
Now, many people think about inflammation, they think about that redness or the swelling or soreness when you injure, a limb or a finger, or in our joints when we think about arthritis. What do we mean when we talk about inflammation in the brain in MS?
There are many similarities, and I think the picture that you see up there shows those areas that are bright white that we refer to as the MS lesions, and I'll refer back to that in a moment, but it's worth taking a step back and recognizing that the word inflammation is a very general term used for rather broadly to point out immune responses, many of which, as was pointed out before, are necessary for us to mount on a regular basis as part of protecting ourselves every day, both from external pathogens, bacteria, viruses, and so on, as well as for tumors. And the immune system is made up, as you've heard, from different types of cells and factors that are released from cells, including antibodies, that are there to protect us against a very broad range of potential exposures, as well as survey again against the tumors. To do so, the immune system, which you can think of as an organ that is rather diffuse and very mobile, has the capacity to orchestrate movement of different types of cells and release different factors in what we consider to be a very context-dependent way. And that means that it does different things when required to do so in different contexts. It interacts with our gut, the bugs that are present in our gut. You've heard the word the microbiome. It sees many, many millions of bugs on a daily basis, whether inside our bodies in the gut or external exposures, and needs to make decisions every moment of every day to distinguish what is self from what is foreign, to be very effective at getting rid of foreign without, ideally, hurting self at the same time. So the immune system machinery is capable of killing cells and normally is able to make those decisions quite well, what is foreign and what is self. And every once in a while, for reasons that we are still learning about, probably a combination of genetic susceptibility and environmental exposures that result in people's immune system working for the most part quite well, but every once in a while spilling over, if you like, and attacking self. And when the body is exposed to a foreign pathogen, if you step on a nail, for example, your immune cells will respond and recognize things that are foreign and start releasing substances that make the blood vessels expand, the blood flow increases, you get heat, you get redness. These are the typical features of inflammation. In multiple sclerosis, when we think of the classical inflammation in the brain, we think of waves of immune cells that come and invade around vessels, and that is reflected in the picture above, those areas that are bright white on this magnetic resonance imaging or MRI scan reflect areas where immune cells have crossed the blood vessel into the tissue of the brain or the spinal cord, and in doing so have resulted in some local swelling, collection of immune cells that can cause damage to the myelin and to the axons, the neurons themselves.
And so if we're talking about different contexts, is the inflammation different in relapsing remitting MS as it is in progressive types of MS? Is it a different type of inflammation?
We increasingly think so. So there used to be a period where we considered relapsing MS to be based on inflammation gone awry versus progressive MS, which people had referred to as being more of a degeneration. And so people had considered inflammation versus degeneration. I think the view that has emerged is that progressive forms of MS do involve inflammation on an ongoing basis, so some degree of inflammation appears to be involved throughout the spectrum of multiple sclerosis. But inflammation, if you like, of different flavors. And so the relapsing remitting MS reflects what I had described before as waves of inflammation from the outside invading around blood vessels and creating these multifocal lesions that we've described. And they are a consequence of immune cells interacting outside of the brain and for some reason not being sufficiently regulated and creating these waves of invasion or infiltration. In contrast, what we think is happening in progressive MS is that you have immune cells that may be setting up shop within the central nervous system. And once they do so, they may care less about new waves of inflammation coming from the outside. They represent what we call central nervous system compartmentalized inflammation. And in the picture above, what you can see on the far left is a representation of aspects of the immune system outside of the central nervous system, so the bone marrow and the spleen and lymph nodes. And then you have this cartoon picture of the brain where in the center you see some immune cell collections around vessels. Those would be inflammatory areas as part of, we think, relapsing remitting MS. But you'll also see on the right-hand side, both at the bottom and at the top, areas where immune cells seem to collect on the surface of the brain. And these immune cells appear to be present in the meninges, which are part of the wrapping membranes around the brain. We think they are there and they've set up shop as part of the CNS compartmentalized process, and in their presence may be contributing, perhaps through the release of various factors that are injurious to the underlying tissue. And we certainly know now that in addition to the areas around the vessels that represent the effects of relapsing remitting immune cell invasion, that the MS brain and spinal cord are involved not just in those multifocal regions, but more diffusely, as we say, including a superficial injury, which may be very important for progressive forms of MS. And it's attractive to speculate that immune cells sitting in the meninges, and perhaps infected with EBV, are contributing to the underlying injury to the CNS in the progressive forms of MS.
And there seem to be a lot of effective treatments now to help control inflammation in relapsing forms of MS. What do you think are the most promising ways that we can tackle inflammation in progressive MS?
So we've certainly, as you point out, now have a range of therapies that when you think about how they may work for relapsing remitting MS, they are in one way or another disrupting these cascades or interactions of immune cells that result in the aberrant response and the waves of inflammation. They either decrease the bad guys, or they promote good guys that try to regulate, or they prevent the trafficking of cells into the central nervous system. And we've learned, as has been mentioned, that we can be quite effective at limiting MS relapses by either targeting T cell responses or B cell responses. They seem to talk to each other, in part leading to the MS attacks. These treatments have not been particularly effective at changing the course, certainly not meaningfully changing the course over time, of progressive forms of MS, with very few exceptions that may limit that progression to a small degree. And that probably is in part because they're not accessing, these treatments administered in the periphery are not accessing the central nervous system to be able to have an impact on inflammation within the CNS, and also possibly because that flavor of inflammation in the CNS, which includes not just the immune cells that I'd mentioned perhaps on the surface of the brain, but immune cells of the brain that get activated and probably contribute as well to propagation of injury, such as microglial cells that you will have heard of a great deal at this meeting about. We need treatments that access the CNS, or at least change the outside so that when it does access the CNS, it has a protective or an anti-inflammatory effect.
So that leads into my next question, which was, where do you think the next breakthrough will come for progressive forms of MS?
Well, I think in two forms. One is that we need to have some kind of proof of principle that impacting the immune cells sitting on the surface of the brain can change the face of progressive MS. That will be a very important insight. And it may be that the first approach of achieving it will not be the last approach of achieving it, but we're looking for that important step in identifying a treatment that will access the CNS and abrogate or stop that form of inflammation, to learn something critical about its role in progressive MS and to stop it. The other, of course, is that in addition to halting progressive MS, we'd love to figure out how to fix things that are already broken, and that is the whole field of repair and recovery.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Barr. That was really interesting. Could you please put your hands together to thank Professor Barr? Thank you. Now, we're going to be taking a short break, but coming up after break, we have two scientists sharing their insights into progressive MS, so we're going to be hearing more about progressive MS. Plus, we'll also be putting your questions to the panel in the Q&A session. Now, before you go and grab your cup of tea, don't forget you can stay in touch with reliable MS information as it happens by liking us on Facebook and also by going to our website www.msra.org.au and subscribing to our newsletter. And the break is the perfect time to email us your questions in for the Q&A. The address is on the screen, and for those of you in the room, there's also a box at the back where you can pop your questions in. See you soon, and we will be back in about 15 minutes. Thank you.
If you're watching this at home and you think your friends or family might be interested in the stream, you can share it very easily. You can share it on Facebook, and it's also available on demand on our website. Now, in this session, we're going to hear from two leading experts on progressive MS and the immune system. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Jack Antel, and then we're going to hear from Professor Ann Laflamme. Now, progressive MS is one of the great unmet needs in MS research, and we're going to be hearing about some of the research that's going on into progressive MS. And we're also going to be hearing how some researchers are trying to take existing drugs and repurpose them for the treatment of progressive MS. Now, after we hear from our two wonderful scientists, I'm going to be leading a question session where I'm going to be asking our four expert panelists and our very own Dr. Lisa Melton the questions that you've submitted from home and also the ones that we've received from our audience tonight. But let's get this session started, and I'd like to hand it back to our wonderful host, Renee Coffey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hamish, and welcome back. I'm really eager to kick off the second part of our evening together. Progressive MS has been a tough one from a research point of view because we know so little about it. But it is changing with more focus on progressive MS by researchers and through the fantastic work of the International Progressive MS Alliance, of which MS Research Australia is a managing member and also works closely with. I'm now joined by Dr. Jack Antel, a Canadian MS neurologist and professor at McGill University in Montreal. His research looks at the underlying mechanisms of progressive MS. Please make him welcome. Welcome, Dr. Antel. I do believe that you've been looking into the biology of progressive MS. What is the immune system doing in MS, and how does the immune system damage the myelin and the nerves in MS?
So I will pick up the theme that Amit Barr started with in terms of the immune cells coming into the brain, and as Amit said, some of these cells are setting up shop, as he calls it, within the central nervous system, so that in the acute MS, or what we've called the relapsing MS, we think that that acute inflammation is causing acute damage and acute symptoms. When the immune system has come, and perhaps two things can happen. One is that it can change the whole microenvironment of the brain so that it is different even after these initial immune cells may have disappeared, so that whether the cells that are living in the brain, which we call glial cells, which we call astrocytes, microglial cells as mentioned, if they've changed their properties, they can in fact contribute to an ongoing process even if the initial damaging immune cells have disappeared. So I think that we have to think about what is the consequences of that initial injury, and also injury itself attracts the immune system. And so whether we're getting ourselves into a vicious circle, we get some element of injury, and the immune cells, they're there to clear away injury. And so we have a cycle of events that perhaps we can interfere with.
And so they're the processes that are going on in that add to the damage.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. Are there ways that we can help protect nerves and also to repair myelin? And what research are you doing in that area?
So, so first of all, let me take this opportunity to thank your group for supporting the International Progressive Alliance. I'm fortunate to be part of 2 of those programs, and we're dealing exactly with the issues that you raised. So one of the issues that has, let me just backtrack a step, and if you look at MS and the outcome, not everybody gets progressive MS. And whether we can take the opportunity from all of our studies, if we could understand why some people don't get the process, perhaps we can understand more why some people do. But I mentioned in relapsing MS where we get this initial abrupt injury, and that occurs, but we also think about whether some of the cells that are targeted, the myelin cells or the underlying nerve cells, maybe they withstand some of the initial injury, but they are still under constant stress, both because of an injury and that's already occurred, plus the ongoing, as I mentioned, change in the environment. And perhaps we can introduce therapies that make the targets of the damage we can make them more resistant to injury. So if we pick up on what Amit was talking about, that in fact therapies, and we're going to hear more from Ann about targeting the immune system, but can we target the targets, so to speak, and make them more resistant? Then, of course, we get into the other end, is that if losing the insulation around the nerve fibers is so important, this loss of myelin, are there ways of promoting the repair of the myelin? And repair of myelin is a much easier, in fact, proposition than replacing nerve cells, because nerve cells, you've got to get the connections wired up again. Myelin may be easier in terms of getting cells to come in, recognizing that the nerve fibers are there, and repairing them. We also, again, if we make the nerve fibers healthier, it may be that myelin will be more efficient.
That's music to my ears. How has our understanding of the biology behind progressive MS changed over, say, the last 20 years?
So I think that the biology, it's still, it's only fair to say we have a long way to go. And it's, I guess, unfortunate that as far as we can tell, mice and animals do not get MS. And so we're still struggling to get the models in place so that we can test out our biologic principles. But I think that what we have learned is we've learned about more of the properties of chronic inflammation, whether it's on the surface of the brain or inside of the brain. We've learned that these supporting cells, what I've called the glial cells, the astrocytes and the microglia, are dynamic cells, and they can produce an array of molecules that at some point would be helpful and sometimes they'd be harmful. And this is the program that my colleague Fran Quintana leads for the Progressive Alliance. Can we learn how to manipulate the properties of these cells? And I don't think we recognized how plastic these cells were until recently. And then the other side is the proof of principle that remyelination is possible if we could only figure out what are the positive signals we have to provide, and maybe just as important, and this has been a theme of the meeting that we've had here, or maybe there are negative signals that are holding back this process. If we could remove the inhibitory signals, the process would appear. And that's finding such agents is the program that's led by Gianvito Martino, who, from the Progressive Alliance, who just gave a marvelous overview talk of this at this conference.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Antel, for your insights, but also for the important work that you're doing in this area. Thank you very much. Everyone, could you please thank Dr. Antel? As a person with MS, we all know how important research is, but now let's hear why our researchers think that it's important.
It's very important to raise money for ongoing research. You can't develop new cures without research. There's obviously a shortage of money to fund research. There's more ideas than money to fund it. And the rate of progress is dependent on funding.
There's so many fascinating avenues for us to investigate. This is a disease that's fiendishly complicated, and there's many, many different mechanisms that are obviously at play. And we have so many different irons in the fire right now that our ability to further investigate is really only limited by the resources that we've got. There's so much to do.
MS is not a problem of a few patients. I'm sure everybody knows somebody with MS, may have a cousin or a mother or be affected themselves. So I think we all see the problem and we all need to fight together. And that's why fundraising is just one bit of this fighting. It's one way everybody can participate in finding the cure.
So raising funds for MS is really important, obviously to further our goals of finding new therapies and ultimately a cure for MS. It's also really important to invest now because there are very skilled researchers that are coming through, and without further investment we tend to lose those researchers to other fields. So the more that we can support people who have an interest in studying MS, the more likely we are to be able to get the best minds to work on this disease.
It's actually really crucial to continue to raise funds for MS research, because without funding we can't continue. If there's not enough money in order for us to carry out our research, our vital research, then the hope for the cure is diminished, it's lost. We won't get there without the funding. So.
As a scientist doing research into MS, I can say that we're very grateful to the people who raise money for Multiple Sclerosis Research Australia. That work is crucial to maintaining the momentum of the research that we do.
So we've just heard that MS is fiendishly complicated, so it's lucky we've got some of the best and brightest scientists in the world working on this cause, and I'm joined now with tonight's final speaker, Professor Ann Laflamme, all the way from New Zealand. Professor Laflamme is an immunologist who has studied many different parts of the immune system, but her main interest is how the immune system controls disease. So welcome, Professor Laflamme.
Thank you.
Now, Professor Laflamme, you've been looking into progressive MS and in particular something called innate immune cells. What are they and why are you so interested in them?
So when you look at the immune system, you can find pretty much all of the different types of immune cells in your blood. And those are white blood cells. And I think I put a picture up on the, what is that? That's the left-hand side of the screen. And there are a variety of different cells, each with different functions, and they all work together. And many of the cells that actually Amit has talked about, Jack has talked a little bit about, and
Professor Pender.
I'm sorry, so Michael Pender has spoken about are the lymphocytes. And when you look at the function of that white blood cell, it's very unassuming in the blood, but they have specificity and they have memory. So these are the ones that are going to target, and they can direct other cells to do the damage. Now, the innate cells, if you think of the lymphocytes directing, they're the foot soldiers that go out and do a lot of the damage. And so it's the range of those cells getting into the brain in the lesions that Amit was describing. While the T cells may direct where to go, it's those innate cells that can do that damage, can destroy the myelin. And so I'm interested in those cells because they are the ones that do the damage. They are also very, very plastic in how they interpret signals around them. And so you can change them. You can modify them from being destructive. You can change them to being more reparative. Because within the immune system, we always focus on how dangerous it is, how it's great at killing and destroying. You know. But as with any army, in peacetime, that army ends up doing other duties. And those duties can be in reparation and remodeling and supporting the tissue structure. And that's sort of the response that we want to target and try to get these cells to do.
Fantastic. And now another topic that you've referred to is Immuno Regulation. Could you please explain that to me?
Okay. So it's a very broad term, and it's used to change the flavor. I think that's how Amit was describing it, how there are many flavors, many functions that the immune system can have and can take over. And you know, at times you need those destructive sort of functions, and other times you want those that support reparation, that support repair and cleaning up after an injury. And in many ways, you want to regulate not only the innate cells, but also those T cells or B cells, because they're also part of that whole conversation and shaping of the immune response. And that the shape of the immune response can happen systemically, so all of the immune cells can take on that, but most of the time it occurs very locally. And so you want to sometimes change that flavor.
Fantastic. So your work has been investigating repurposing medicines.
Oh, I think I was going to talk actually about an example.
Oh, you do have an, okay, wonderful. I would love an example, please.
Because in fact, this is a strategy that has been used in treating MS. And I thought I'd give you an example of what that means in the context of, say, an innate immune cell, and one innate immune cell, the monocyte, which you find circulating in the blood. And it was a project that was done by a lovely PhD student who was trying to understand if those monocytes looked different in an MS patient or not. And so she went through and categorized them, characterized them, and found that they were very activated. Now, she looked at many different features, okay, but as you know, you look at each little feature directly, it only sums up to very small things. And so she used the power of math to pull it all together and say, okay, in all of these different people, either healthy people or people with multiple sclerosis, do their monocytes look different when you look at everything all together? And so I put what we call a heat map, which is looking at a range of different characteristics on each individual person, using math to say, okay, who looks like who? And if you look at the patterns, in general, what you find is that all of those that are healthy fit together. They all look relatively similar. And those that had MS looked very different. Now, she also kept a group of MS patients and analyzed them that were treated with glatiramer acetate, which was suspected to be an immunomodulator, so it causes immune regulation. Although at the time, the target was not understood exactly how that was working. And what she found was now those patients, the monocytes from those people, looked more like those from healthy subjects as opposed to the MS patients that were untreated, suggesting that this sort of immune modulation was a successful strategy. Now, this is an immune modulation that happens in the peripheral immune system, so outside of the central nervous system, which is really what this is an example of. Now, the question is, can we take that idea of shifting the flavor from being this activated, ready to do damage flavor to one which is more reparative, more calming? And can we do that in progressive MS?
And your work has been investigating the repurposing of medicines, which were designed for other indications, for use in MS instead. What is repurposing and how does this work?
So repurposing is not a new idea. And in fact, it has been extremely useful for finding drugs in MS. And in fact, if you look at the drugs that are currently available, there are quite a few that have been repurposed from another disease indication. And many actually have come from the cancer sphere and have been repurposed because they will target T cells or B cells and deplete them such that they will not be able to enter into the central nervous system, into the brain, and cause damage. So the question then is, are there repurposed agents or agents out there that could be repurposed to do that immune modulation? And that was our target. And one of the reasons why it's very difficult in progressive MS is that getting something into the brain is a difficult proposition, because the brain is a very regulated structure, that trafficking. Not only are immune cells regulated, but everything else is regulated coming in and out. And so we started by looking at drugs that we knew were active in the central nervous system and that were reported to be immunomodulatory. And so that was our start. And so we designed a trial to start looking at that process.
And what types of drugs were you looking at?
So these were drugs that were developed to treat schizophrenia. They're known as the atypical antipsychotic agents. And what they do is they target neuroreceptors and alter some of those signals. They rebalance in some way. Now, some people may say, well, that's schizophrenia. That's different from MS. And yes, it is completely different from MS. However, those neuroreceptors that you find throughout the brain are in fact found on immune cells as well. And so we, growing up as an immunologist, we thought, oh, neuroreceptors, neurotransmitters, that's all the central nervous system. That has nothing to do with the immune system. But we're now finding, in fact, that immune cells and the cells of the central nervous system, the glia, the astrocytes, the microglia, microglia are, in fact, part of the immune system, but they talk to each other, and they use some of those signals, the neurotransmitters and the neuroreceptors that are there.
Fantastic. So we've got a slide here. Are these some more of the amazing people that have been working in this field? Is that?
Yes, I thought I would acknowledge that while I talk about research that we do, that in fact there are a lot of people that are behind each one of us that are doing the work, that are spending long hours trying to find solutions. And there are also a lot of funding agencies, both those that may be government agencies, but also there are quite a number of charitable foundations that support MS research, and hopefully will provide hope soon.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Laflamme, to you, but also to your teams and the teams of our other speakers as well. I think that's a great point that you make about the other researchers working in this field, doing this important work and edging us closer and closer to a cure. So thank you so much. That is my job done for the evening. I really hoped you enjoyed hearing from these scientists as much as that I did, and I can now hand you over to the capable hands of Dr. Hamish Campbell from MS Research Australia. He's been busy compiling the questions that you've sent through while we've been hearing from the researchers. So over to you, Hamish.
Well, thank you, Renee. And as you said, we have received a large number of questions, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to answer them all. I've tried to kind of compile them into kind of suitable topics to kind of cover kind of commonly asked questions. But please do note, we can't really answer any questions about personal treatment or personal circumstances. But we have received a large number of very interesting questions. They're very wide-ranging, from risk factors of MS through to brain atrophy, and also to lifestyle factors, and of course, questions about the cure. So I'm now joined by our panel. We've got our very own Dr. Lisa Melton, Professor Pender, Professor Barr, Professor Laflamme, and Dr. Jack Antel. So thank you very much for joining me back up on stage. We do have a number of questions, and I think you'll find some of them challenging. So we'll give it a go. First up, we'll start with Dr. Melton. Is there a higher risk of MS if the parent has MS? So what's the chances of passing on, or what's the increased risk for someone who has a parent with MS?
So we do know that there is a genetic component to MS. It's not a truly inherited disorder in the way that some truly genetic conditions pass down through family generations. But there's been a huge amount of research into the genetics of MS. So we do know that there are genes that are risk factors for MS. So if you carry these genes, there are little variations in the genes that we have, there's an increased risk of developing MS. So the risk for a child of an adult with MS, it is slightly increased in comparison to the general population. So there is that family risk there. But it's in no way a guarantee that if someone in your family has MS that you're also going to develop MS. So it's not. There's many other factors as well as the genetics. There are lifestyle factors, environmental factors that contribute to the risk of developing MS.
So we've also got a question about if it is a child of a parent with MS, should they be avoiding anything? Should they be taking vitamin D? So maybe I will throw it open to the rest of the panel about other risk factors that may be involved in the development of MS. So we've heard about EPV, vitamin D is a common one. Anne, do you want to add to the list?
Well, there's always the latitude effect, and that seems to be linked to sunlight as well as to vitamin D.
Yep, so that's a perfect one. And that probably leads into my next question. Professor Pender, we've been asked a question about a recent scientific publication which talked about EPV and pinworm and a hypothesis that the two may be linked to MS. What are your thoughts on that matter?
Well, yes, I've read that hypothesis and it's interesting. As I mentioned earlier, EBV is unique among the infectious agents in being uniquely associated with MS. But it's been known for many years that any infection, bacterial, viral, upper respiratory, gastrointestinal, that attacks of MS, relapses, are 3 times more common within a few weeks of any infectious agent, of any infection. And, you know, whether a helminth like Enterobius or the pinworm may have a role in that is a possibility. We don't know, it's not known how these other infections trigger attacks. It's thought that they increase the number of autoreactive T cells and maybe B cells, that is, cells capable of attacking the brain, increases those following that acute infection. No, it's an important, it's a good idea and worth further thought.
More further research probably required.
Further research.
Excellent. Yeah. So the next question is from a lady who has 2 autoimmune conditions. And so is it common for people with MS to also have another autoimmune disease, or is it if the immune system is going slightly awry, it's likely to kind of lead to multiple diseases? Maybe Dr. Antel, do you have anything to add to that?
So the power of genetics is so remarkable now of being able to screen the entire genome that the data, it's a whole field unto itself of bioinformatics and how to deal with it. And there are publications where they've compared the overall genetic makeup of people with every disease you can think of. And though the inflammatory diseases seem to segregate into or be closely aligned with each other. So it does seem to be that there are certain genes that predispose you to inflammatory conditions. And it also has given some more evidence that MS falls into the inflammation or immune disorders because other, what we call degenerative neurologic diseases do not show that pattern. But it is still very remarkable how MS mostly is a standalone disease. So although there's some overlap and susceptibility based on genetics, it is not a disease where there are always multiple other organs affected. And in fact, clinically, if many organs are affected, then we have to think of different disorders.
Excellent. Anybody else want to add anything? I think that answer was pretty encompassing. So the next one is the question about important lifestyle factors and influencing the quality of life. And so the question is, what would be your advice to people with MS regarding lifestyle factors which could influence the quality of life and what they should be doing about this factor? Amit, do you want to
Sure. So you've heard a little bit about some of the risk factors that we think are modifiable. People have identified that in addition to the possibility of taking some vitamin D to perhaps decrease the risk of developing MS in the first place, but also perhaps to decrease MS activity in established MS, smoking is a bad player. Overweight has been implicated as well as a risk factor for developing MS, and there's a lot of interest in whether people who have or live with multiple sclerosis, to what extent is avoidance of smoking and overweight state relevant to limiting MS activity. There is a tremendous amount of information out there, people suggesting very strongly you must do this or you must avoid that, making it very difficult for people living with MS to sort through all that information. And I think one thing that has emerged as helpful is that in some ways what is good for the heart is good for MS. And so if you live a life that your heart doctor would advocate, chances are you're doing well by your MS as well, avoiding smoking, keeping active, eating a balanced diet.
Excellent. That was a very good answer. And the next question is about hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. It's probably quite apt that we're at a Neuro Immunological conference, because the question is, how is it thought to work on the immune system? Professor Pender, do you want to address that one?
Well, I'm not sure what the latest theory is, but the fact is that an important part of hematopoietic stem cell transplantation is you have to wipe out the immune system to start with. So you're going to kill the B cells that potentially could produce autoreactive responses. You're going to kill the EBV-infected B cells. You're going to kill the T cells that could be autoreactive T cells, inducing damage to the brain. And you're going to kill the EBV-specific T cells, which I believe are important in preventing and controlling MS, EBV infection. So, and you're also affecting other white cells as well. So I think, in my opinion, it'd be very difficult to work out what actually is the mechanism. But there'll be others in the room who will know more about that than I do.
Does anybody else want to?
I think an important issue to raise is that when these therapies, whether it's what was referred to as hematopoietic stem cells, which in fact is a major an approach to significantly block the immune system, almost to the extent that you have to rescue the immune system by giving a transplant, that in fact it has been looked at across the realm of MS, and the results in the progressive MS have not been anywhere near what has been seen in the uncontrollable relapsing MS. And it comes back to, from an understanding or biology point of view, of are there differences in mechanism of disease over time? So that's one issue. The other, which I think is terribly important, is with all of these therapies that are raised, are safety issues and risk taking. And so that I think we have to be realistic if we have to apply therapies to where they fit. And I think this is a lesson that we're learning on an ongoing basis. And with each of the new therapies, with perhaps the hematopoietic stem cell being the most extreme, is where do we position it? Obviously, those of us who do clinical work want to provide the best for everybody. And those of you who have the disease or have family members, you want the best to be done. So there has to be a realism in this as well.
I might just add another comment, is that when someone mentions the term stem cells in MS, it's important to recognize that there are multiple different types of stem cells, very, very different in their biology and what they may offer in terms of their impact on the immune system or the brain. One of the attractive thoughts had been that stem cells, which by definition can turn into other cells, could perhaps replace damaged tissue in different organs of the body, and maybe including in the central nervous system. And actually, of all the things that we've tried over the years, that has been the hardest to either accomplish or to prove. The hematopoietic stem cell, again, there's some misconception by some people in terms of what the actual goal of the treatment is. These are stem cells that come from the bone marrow, from the immune cells, the immune stem cells. The idea is that you take them out, typically. The ones that have been applied in MS are autologous, meaning they come from the same person. So you will take them out of the blood, you'll freeze them, and then you give the person, as was mentioned, very, very, very strong chemotherapy, which essentially kills their immune system, taking away the bad guys, and you save them by giving them a new immune system through the stem cells. So the main job of the stem cells is to replace the lost immune system that was lost as part of the treatment. It appears less likely that those stem cells actually turn into new myelin-making cells or new neurons, even though that had been sort of the sexy view of them.
Yeah, so I suppose it's all, but yes, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think part of it then is the idea that you eliminate the bad guys, but in that it is also that rebirth in a way, that redevelopment, and that is thought to really, I think, harness the reparative arms and that process. But you have to, it's very aggressive to get to that point. And you have to have someone that has an immune system that is still going to be adaptable and flexible and be able to enable that rebirth to happen, which is why it's not for everyone. And so choosing the correct patient that's going to respond is really important at that point.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And that probably kind of leads on to the next question, which is also about hematopoietic stem cell transplant. I'll probably aim this to you, Lisa. It's about what is the availability of this treatment in Australia?
Yeah, so as my colleagues have pointed out, it's a treatment that is, the international data is suggesting that for some people with MS, it is very effective. You reboot the immune system, and it's very effective in suppressing the inflammation and the relapses of MS. And that can produce quite a prolonged remission for many people who have the treatment. But as we've heard, it's a very strong treatment. It's very intensive chemotherapy, and it carries risks with it. So it's got a place in the array of treatments that we have available for MS. But it's probably not the first treatment that you would reach for the majority of patients. So particularly in Australia, it's reserved for people who are not responding to the other therapies. We're very fortunate in Australia that the neurologists have access to the full range of MS treatments. And so it's about finding the right treatment for every individual. And every individual is going to have different other health issues that they might be contending with, family planning, their work and so on, that all comes into that decision-making about treatments. And so trying those other therapies first and close monitoring, and then if they're not responding to those treatments, trying a new therapy. And for in Australia, HSCT has been reserved for people who have not responded to other MS therapies. And there are 2 or 3 hospitals in Australia, particularly in Melbourne and in Sydney, where the treatment is available under those circumstances where patients have not been responding to other therapies.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that answer. So the next one is probably quite a broad question. Do you think someone will come up with something just to stop MS, halt MS, reverse it, scare it away? So how far do you think we're away from a cure for MS? Who wants to go first? Anne, you look at you ready to go.
Well, developing a cure means, one, we know the cause, and it also means that that cause is the same in every person with MS. So that's a difficulty. So we may, and I think it's not unlikely that we can find a cure for some forms of MS, but maybe take a little bit longer for others. But it's going to take a lot of work, and a lot of work understanding what is necessary to achieve that. So what is really kind of that linchpin that is driving disease that could enable cure as opposed to just a control.
So do you think a cure would be a stop, or are we talking about a reverse of MS?
Well, a cure, I would say, would be a stop, but the better cure would be to be able to reverse, to repair, and to enable recovery.
Professor Barr, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree in principle. I think that what a cure is depends on the person, in the sense that if you happen to have had MS diagnosed yesterday, perhaps incidentally because you bumped your head and had an MRI, and it turns out that you have MS, or you've had one attack that recovered essentially fully. For you, a cure would be to be promised that you will never have any further injury of your central nervous system. That would be halting any new injury, which for many people would be incredibly important, but not for those who may already be using a cane or be wheelchair bound. For them, a cure is, I want to run again. And that is a different order in terms of advancing therapies, because then you're not just talking about stopping new injury, you're talking about fixing things that are already broken. And I think that we are closer over the next years to see, at least for some patients, the ability to halt further injury. We're not quite as close as we'd like to be at, that maybe on a 5, 10, 15-year horizon, to being able to reverse injury, which of course is not a unique problem for multiple sclerosis, but for any condition of the central nervous system where damage is done, we're looking very hard for repair mechanisms.
Well, actually, you've probably just answered the very next question, which was, do you think it's going to be possible to heal the lesions in the brain and spinal cord in people with MS? And so you'll be saying that you think it is possible?
I think it is. I think that it's a complex problem. And I think one thing that we have learned, and this meeting is a very good example of it, is bringing people from multiple different areas of injury to the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and what can my condition teach you about yours and vice versa, because the themes are shared themes in terms of trying to understand both the mechanisms of the injury but also mechanisms of repair.
But it's interesting, I mean, you're sitting at a Neuro Immunology conference, but there's also a wider spectrum of people looking into how to deal with some of these symptoms, and that if we are arresting damage, there's more enthusiasm in terms of recovery, repair, even things like the rehabilitation people, can they be more sophisticated in their approaches? There is a whole emerging area of interventions to have what one would call functional improvement or functional recovery. And so at least many of us are impressed that multiple communities are coming together now to deal with symptomatic management of the disease. And I think there's more enthusiasm because at least people can accept that we are arresting the damage much more effectively than we did previously.
And just to add to what Jack's saying, and Jack and I were both at the conference of the International Progressive MS Alliance in Toronto earlier in the year, where we learned a lot from people who came to speak from the stroke field, and they're well ahead of the MS game in terms of the work that they've done in not just repairing the damage, the lesion that's happened, but actually to circumvent that lesion and to get around it through rehabilitation and neuroplasticity, so building new routes in the brain so you can still perform the same function, move your arm even though that the piece of your brain that used to move the arm has been damaged. And that takes really intensive rehabilitation, many, many hours. And I think that there's not enough recognition that there's more that can be done in that rehabilitation field in the MS world. And I think we really need to learn from our colleagues in stroke and spinal cord injury and work together on that.
Excellent. So the next question is about gut microbes and how are they involved in autoimmune conditions such as MS? Who wants to handle that one?
Well, I can start. I was really excited. The session I went to earlier on today at the conference and a talk yesterday as well about the gut microbiome. And I think what's becoming clear is that the gut microbiome in people with MS is different to the general population. The key take-home message, I think, for me from the presentation is that diversity in the different types of bacteria that live inside us is really important. And part of that is the diet that we eat and making sure we're eating plenty of fibre. The happy bacteria that are helpful to the immune system seem to thrive on fibre as well. So things like that that are relatively easy to do in terms of people living with MS is really interesting, but there's still information that we don't know about the mechanism of how the gut is affecting the brain and the immune system and vice versa. And I think if we're really going to use the gut microbiota to potentially treat MS, we're not quite there yet in terms of our understanding of the mechanisms. And but it's certainly a really burgeoning field. There's a lot of research going on, and I think it's a watch this space. But perhaps others want to add to that.
I think I'll add just a little bit in that when we think the gut and the brain are two disparate organs, but the immune system does connect that because the immune system travels everywhere. Those cells are never stationary, they're continuously moving. And so in that, what happens in the gut can shape that system and shape that such that it can exert the effects differently in other organs, such as in the brain.
Okay, brilliant. So this is another probably kind of quite a wide-ranging question, or kind of a speculative question. How far away are we from a treatment for progressive MS? Amit, do you want to?
Well, I think we've touched on that a little bit. My projection had been, and I'm interested in other people's thoughts, that we are going to make, I think, important advances in the next few years, let's say 3 to 10 years, that will get us to a point where we are, at least in some patients, limiting substantially progression of MS. The question is, can we again fix things that are broken? And to me, that horizon is more prolonged. Others?
Yeah, and do you want to add to that? Or?
No, I think that's about right. I think we have new targets to look at trying to quell the immune response that's compartmentalized, that's within the CNS. And in fact, the ocrelizumab that just came out shows that there's some benefit to that, which is, again, targeting some of those immune cells that are there that could be driving in progressive disease. And I think, then the next step is really repair. And that is where people are really hotly working.
I think one of the concepts that is now, we need to be sure we were right, is that in this generation where the therapies for relapsing or early MS were introduced, when you look back, that although we decreased the relapse rate and had an impact, we did not completely shut down the disease to the extent that we're now capable of. And one of the major postulates is if you minimize, if not eliminate, ongoing and early damage, how will we eliminate or retard or prevent or inhibit progressive MS in a large proportion of people? I hope that that prediction is right. And that's what we're looking forward to seeing, whether we really have made it. It's clear that there are people who are having progressive MS from the outset. There are people who have symptoms that are disabling right from the outset. We still have to deal with that. But we may, in terms of the major approach we have had in the last recent times, is shutting down early disease activity. Is that going to be a prevention or a cure for progressive MS? I don't want to be that optimistic, but I hope we've made a major impact in that regard.
I think that's I think that's a very important point that reflects sort of a paradigm shift in the thinking of the field, where when we had the initial medications, the injectables that on the average would decrease new relapsing MS activity by, let's say, 30–40%, if a person on such a treatment had an attack a year, we'd say, well, that's kind of better than the average, that's probably okay. Nowadays, most of us would not accept that. We would want to try to make sure that the person living with MS has not a single attack or a single new brain lesion. And it's a matter of finding the right therapy for them that will work to do so. And as Jack points out, the important question for us to resolve is whether doing that as early as we can will really change the face of progressive MS in the future. That requires, of course, 10, 20, 30 years of follow-up. But people have been referring to MS nowadays as sort of the new MS, with a view that someone diagnosed today with MS can expect a course that is likely very different from someone who had been diagnosed with MS even 10, 15, 20, certainly years ago.
Excellent. So sorry.
I was going to say, in progressive MS, I think there's another element to be considered. Certainly the goal is firstly to switch off ongoing immune attack on the brain in progressive MS to prevent further damage. But I believe that ongoing immune attack is not only causing further damage, but inhibiting repair. For example, autoantibodies preventing remyelination or axonal sprouting, T cells killing oligodendrocyte precursors, progenitors, early remyelinating cells. So, so there may, although we will still need, in particularly people who've had prolonged disability for many years, there'll have to be additional interventions, as Dr. Antel and Amit have mentioned, to promote repair. But I think if you can actually specifically switch off the immune attack in progressive MS, not only may you stop the disease getting worse, but you may actually get some repair because you're no longer inhibiting, the immune system is no longer inhibiting actively, I believe, that repair process.
Excellent. So this is now a question on brain atrophy. So how does MS inflammation contribute to brain atrophy? Or are they not related? And if not, do we know what contributes to the brain atrophy of people living with MS? But probably before we ask that question, we probably need a definition or kind of an explanation of what brain atrophy is. Jack, do you want to just talk briefly on what brain atrophy is?
So, brain atrophy is just referring a loss of brain substance, and that after about age of 15 or 20, all of us are losing a certain amount of brain substance every year. And you get into what is normal aging, and I would challenge anybody at the age of 50 to try and compete with a 14-year-old in terms of memory and other. So but in MS, is there an accelerated loss of this brain volume? And here is where you get into, so the answer is yes in many cases. And here is where you get into the complicated issue, is whether these insults that we've been talking about, you saw on the MRI picture that Amit showed, whether the destruction of nerve fibers from the inflammation is contributing to tissue loss, and if you have ongoing diffuse inflammation, is that contributing? And in addition, over the surface of the brain, as he also was telling us about inflammation over the surface or the lining of the brain, is that impacting also on the surface layers, or what we call the gray matter, so that we have these multiple causes of tissue loss, and we're trying to understand, are they related to each other, are they independent, and that this is an ongoing area of trying to define. One of the reasons that this has come to attention more recently is that, whereas on that picture that Amit showed you of an MRI, all of you could see those white lesions, the amount of atrophy and the change in atrophy particularly is so subtle that you really need advanced computerized technology to measure it. So we're only now entering into the field of being able to really understand the rate of atrophy, how much different it is from the aging process. Do injured nerve fibers die more rapidly than normal nerve fibers? And again, I'll put in a plug for the International Progressive Alliance, who's supporting the work of our friend and colleague in Montreal, Doug Arnold, and his team, who's focusing exactly on that problem.
Excellent.
I might add, if I may, that a practical question that comes up not infrequently, more frequently now, I think, in the clinic, is someone might say, why aren't you measuring my brain atrophy, right? And it's important to understand, as Jack said, that atrophy, that loss of volume, really represents the sum total of all the different contributors to injury over time. It's been a very useful measurement in clinical trials where you might be looking at 500 people on a drug versus 500 people on another drug or on a placebo, because you can quite accurately, with the right approaches, measure the change of volume on the average in a group and talk about a relatively lesser loss of tissue with the treatment versus whatever the comparator is. The problem with individual people in the clinic to apply this concept of atrophy is that your brain will swell and shrink based on your state of hydration. So if you're relatively dehydrated versus well hydrated, the change in volume is greater than the change that an MS brain would experience over a full year. So it makes it very difficult for us today in the clinic to apply this as a practical measurement. And yet people are hearing more and more about the merits of measuring atrophy in the context of MS.
Excellent, yes. Yeah, we are hearing a lot more about it, but there is still technical challenges involved. Professor Pender, obviously your talk has sparked a lot of interest in EPV. So one of the questions we have got is, how did you get infected by Epstein-Barr virus?
Well, it's spread in the saliva. So, as I mentioned earlier, in the healthy people, so probably most of us in this room are infected with EBV, and every day EBV is being reactivated in the tonsil. So we're producing up to 10 billion infectious particles every day in our saliva for the rest of our lives. So saliva, whether it's transferred, from child to child by playing with each other or by kissing, then the saliva is the main mechanism by which the virus spreads. So EBV primarily infects the tonsil, the B cells and the plasma cells in the tonsil, but it can also affect the lining of the tonsil, the epithelial cells, which line the back of the throat. And when those cells are infected, they release the virus, which not only in healthy people, not only sheds the virus into saliva to infect somebody who's not infected, but we're infecting every day new B cells, even in healthy people. But it's so dynamic, the situation, and the immune system is working full-time every moment of the day to control EBV, even in healthy people. So you don't need a big change in that immune control to result in problems, particularly as they accumulate over time. So saliva is the mechanism.
Excellent.
And most people wouldn't know that they've had an EBV infection. So it's mostly caught in early childhood.
Yeah.
It's one of those, mum says, oh, got a virus. It's a non-specific runny nose, cough, etc. So most people wouldn't know that they've been infected with it. When you do know you've been infected with it is when you exposed to it for the first time in adolescence, and then in some people you might develop glandular fever or what's called infectious mononucleosis. And so then you know that that's an EBV infection. So the majority of people have been infected early in life without even knowing it.
Excellent. And also staying with the Epstein-Barr virus theme, are we likely to get a vaccination against it, and what effect would that vaccination have on MS, levels of MS?
Well, there's already been a vaccine produced against EBV and published in a very good journal, Journal of Infectious Disease. And the reason for doing it, this was some years ago, SOKAL, S-O-K-A-L, I think was the first author. See, EBV, in a minority of people infected with EBV, it can lead to serious cancers. And also it can cause glandular fever, as Lisa said. So an important point here is that in the developing world, and probably for the first 200,000 years of human evolution until recently, probably everyone got infected with EBV in the first 3 years of life. And when they do, it's asymptomatic. But as countries become more advanced, for example in Denmark, where MS is very common, then by the age of 12, fewer than half the population are infected with EBV. So EBV infection, as countries become more developed, instead of occurring as it has probably for the last 200,000 years, it's now occurring, instead of in the first year or two of life, it's occurring maybe in adolescence or early adulthood. And as Lisa said, when that happens, in a significant number of people, it produces the syndrome of glandular fever. But even adolescents can still be infected with EBV without getting glandular fever. So anyway, this vaccine. So the main ideas in the past about EBV, trying to control it, because people were not thinking of any autoimmune disease, they were just thinking of these fairly rare cancers and the problem of infectious mononucleosis, which is a problem, but I haven't had it, but I imagine it would be very unpleasant. And it's more severe in women than men, which is very interesting. And I think that's got something to do with the gender bias in autoimmunity towards women. But that this vaccine was developed and was given to adolescents or university college students who had not been infected with EBV. And they showed that it greatly reduced the occurrence of glandular fever. It didn't stop the EBV infection. They still got infected with EBV, but there's an 85% reduction in glandular fever. But then it was made an orphan drug because it thought it wasn't worthwhile. So there is already something there. But I'm sure that there may be, that was in targeting the glycoprotein 350, which is the molecule that allows, well, it helps EBV get into cells. So, and that actually worked in reducing substantially glandular fever.
So would you expect it also to have effect on MS? Or?
I think that would. I mean, I think that it's only targeting, EBV encodes at least 80 different proteins. Lytic proteins involved in reproduction and production of infectious virus, as I mentioned in the saliva, but the majority of them are latent. Well, actually, the majority are lytic antigens, but some are latent. So that particular vaccine I just mentioned will only affect the lytic phase of infection. But I believe that over time that could all add up, and particularly as we've shown that the typical CD8 defect in MS is an impairment of the control of lytic infection. But I'm sure there are approaches being looked at for having other EBV proteins in the vaccine other than that just particular lytic phase protein. And those vaccines might even be more effective.
Yeah, excellent. So studies have shown that there's been an increase in MS, especially in people especially in young people. So has there been a real increase in MS, or just people? Do we have more people living longer with MS? So Amit, do you want to?
Sure. So there have been reports of increasing incidence, the development of MS in earlier life. Part of it probably is because for quite a while, people didn't think that MS occurred in children or in the pediatric age group. And individuals who would have an initial attack that eventually turned out to be MS sometimes had the eventual diagnosis made after transitioning from the pediatric age group into the adult age group, whatever you want that cutoff to be. And people were reluctant to give a diagnosis for multiple sclerosis in the pediatric age. We now know that MS can certainly occur in the pediatric age group. There's an interesting observation that the sex ratio is 1-to-1. It seems pre-puberty, and after puberty, there's the greater predilection for MS developing in women, in females compared to males. And part of, I think, the counting bigger numbers is that people are paying more attention to it. People are being referred earlier. The diagnosis is being made earlier. In part, it reflects the availability of more treatments for people to consider, whereas previously we didn't really have much to offer, so people may be more reluctant to make a diagnosis when there's less to offer. The question of whether MS in general is increasing is an interesting one, and just to comment that these are not easy studies to do because you need to have the right denominator, the number you divide by, to get a sense of how many people out of the general population are getting it over time. One of the best examples, perhaps, is in countries like Japan, where multiple sclerosis had been described as being a little different from the typical MS in comparing Occidental to non-Occidental regions. But what has been increasing in recent years appears to be more the Occidental versus the Oriental form of MS, and the pace of that increase would be too quick to attribute to changes in genetics, and really, again, points the finger to what in the environment may have changed, perhaps diet, perhaps other aspects of living in those areas that has been associated with what appears to be an increased risk.
So Lisa, do you want to mention anything about the Australian situation?
Yeah, so the economic impact report that I mentioned earlier on showed an increase in prevalence, just the increase in a number of people living with MS in Australia right now. But that doesn't tell us anything about whether more people are being diagnosed with MS. There was one recent study from Newcastle area of Australia that showed that there was a slight increase in the number of people being diagnosed with MS. But as Amit said, we need more accurate studies to really give us that information. But just sort of going back to the discussion of the EBV vaccine, in any case, we need to prevent MS. We need to stop people from developing MS in the first place. Prevention is always better than cure, in my mind. But this is a global problem, and it's going to require a global solution. MS Research Australia has been working really hard with the federal government to try and work on a roadmap to defeat MS, and a big part of that roadmap is the prevention of MS. And so working with our global partners, people that are already working on EBV vaccines, people that are looking at vitamin D and ultraviolet light, and childhood obesity, as Amit mentioned, in changes in diet in other countries that are showing an increased incidence. All of these things need to be addressed. But Australia working on its own it's a job that's bigger than us. It's a global problem, so what we really need to do is activate the global community to try and put in place some of these and test out some of these interventions and see whether things like an EBV vaccine could really reduce the incidence of MS.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, that's probably all we have time for. So I'd like to thank our panel, and thank you for answering all the questions we put to you, and thank you for sharing some of the work that you've been doing in the field of MS. We're really glad to hear of it. I'd also like to thank our wonderful host, Renee Coffey, for all her hard work. And so remember, if you like the stream, make sure you share it on Facebook, like us on Facebook, and also subscribe to our newsletters to get the latest MS research news. So I'd like to have a big thanks to everybody involved, and we'll see you next time.